Um, I've got the honor of introducing Professor Geoffrey Samuel, and I have been reading Geoffrey's work for a while, and then when I checked his CV, I was amazed, how dynamic his work has been and his career. So he started his academic career with actually being a natural scientist, and then moved to social anthropology, and then it seems that I'm not so sure if I'm incorrect, so please correct me, Jeff.
You're doing
Um,
fine.
yeah. So and then he did also postgraduate studies in computer science. It seems so. It's incredible, and so his study background very much reflect the dynamic of his work, his research work. So he has been doing research on Tibetan religion, Tibetan medicine, and as far as I could understand, so he has started to looking into health and environment in recent times. So it is really a great honor to have him today to talk to us. So I'm looking forward to listening to you, Jeff. Now the floor is yours.
Well, thank you, Nara, for that very kind introduction. I suppose most of it's sort of true. I mean, it sounds a bit better perhaps than it really is, but still. But that's thank you for that. Okay, it's a great pleasure to be here and to be a part of this event, and it's been quite useful for me also to be, because it stimulated putting together two of the areas that I've got involved in well, when I've been involved in for quite a while, obviously Tibetan culture and religion and health, and the other, the more general situation of the world today in relation to COVID and also to the climate crisis and more general sense of things perhaps going wrong in various ways. It's good to see a few friends out there too, by the way. Hello. I can see some names coming up that are familiar at any rate in some pictures. Okay, so I'll move on to sharing to my PowerPoint if I can get this to work. Okay, can everyone see my PowerPoint? Is that now filling up the screen? Okay. And you could obviously hear me too. So in the title of this talk, I've made a connection between the COVID-19 pandemic and the climate crisis. And that may, or perhaps it may not, be a little surprising. Not for the connection itself. I think for many people around the world, and particularly here in Australia, perhaps where the initial impact of the pandemic followed directly on the disastrous bushfires of late last year and early this year, there's been a tendency to see the pandemic as in some way connected with the climate crisis and other related developments. And there have been many people who've seen the pandemic as an opportunity for a rethink or a reset of our relationship to the planet and our relationship to other life on the planet. There are good reasons to argue that human action, including the devastation of natural environments around the world, has indeed contributed significantly to the growth of zoonotic diseases, the coronavirus among them. But the pandemic has also, in many parts of the world, Australia included, provided a reason for governments to reduce the urgency of their response to the climate crisis and to planetary development, to argue that we cannot waste time and resources to deal with global warming when we have more immediate problems in the pandemic itself and the need to stimulate economic recovery in its wake. Now, many of us probably have views on these matters, and certainly I do myself, but that is not, or at any rate not quite, why the climate crisis appears in my title alongside COVID-19. The reason why it is there is rather that one of the major modes of explanation which Tibetans use to understand and deal with the pandemic also engages with a wider and deeper sense of crisis of which the pandemic is only part. Indeed, it sees the pandemic as part of a potential unraveling of the universe and of the very elements that compose it as a result of unwise and inappropriate human behavior. More of this later. Now, most of the world's Tibetan population lives within the boundaries of the People's Republic of China, and even those Tibetans living outside the PRC tend to be well informed about events in China. So awareness of COVID-19 grew fast among the Tibetans last January and February. People in the Tibetan diaspora in India were already seriously worried about the pandemic at that time, at a point when Australia was having its first known cases, but there was still little sense of public concern among the general Australian population. This high level of Tibetan concern was doubtless in part because, as with other East Asian populations, such as the people of South Korea, Singapore, and Taiwan, the 2002-3 Sars epidemic was still salient in Tibetans' memory. Tibetans were thinking early on about protection from the new epidemic. There were three main sets of resources which came into play as relevant for Tibetans in this connection. And I've listed them up on the slide there: biomedicine, Sowa Rigpa, traditional Tibetan medicine, and Tibetan Buddhist ritual. These are not entirely separate, particularly the last two, but in some ways they are fairly distinct categories. I'll say something about all three in this paper, but I don't have first-hand material on biomedicine and Sowa Rigpa in China or among the Tibetan diaspora, and my main emphasis is going to be on religious and ritual responses to the pandemic. I'll be particularly talking about one major set of ritual procedures and the understandings of the world implicit within them. These are the rituals which see the pandemic as an expression of the turmoil, the disturbance of a group of female spirits known as the Momo. And that's a Tibetan painting which depicts the Momo. It depicts in the center possibly the deity Ekajati, who has the form of a Momo but is used to control or the Momo or interact with the Momo. And you can see other figures in the back, rather scary elderly female figures with wild flaming hair and swords. The central figure is holding a bag in her left hand, which is a bag of diseases. So here we already see the connection with infectious diseases. Now, this is not the first time that the Momo have been invoked in Tibetan history. They're commonly seen as associated with epidemics, and epidemics have happened in Tibet in the past, and with other large-scale problems, but more about this later. Who are the Momo, though? That's not a straightforward question, but it's quite an interesting one. Anyway, as I've mentioned, first to look at other aspects of the Tibetan response to COVID. As I've mentioned in my earlier work, most Tibetan populations today are in a situation of medical pluralism, in which the primary components, biomedicine, Sowa Rigpa, and religious and ritual procedures, are relatively well integrated, at least as far as the Tibetans themselves are concerned. Non-state authorities in China, India, Nepal, or for that matter, Europe or America, have varied in how supportive or hostile they've been to Sowa Rigpa and to Tibetan ritual in relation to such issues. But most Tibetans have generally been happy to see all three approaches as relevant and complementary. Tibetans nevertheless vary in the extent to which they take ritual health measures, including the ritual components of Sowa Rigpa, seriously. Some of you may actually have seen this cartoon by the Tibetan biomedical doctor Thubten Punsog. It's been published in a couple of places in the West. in which you can see this poor guy labeled sick person in the center, and two characters labeled doctor who are kind of ringing him and squeezing money out of him. Thupten Phuntsog was suggesting that some Sowa Rigpa practitioners were making a lot of money. This was back in February, when there was still hardly any COVID in Tibetan areas, by selling unnecessary ritual prescriptions to sick people. And the verse below says, "In places devoid of contagious disease, the Black Nine pill is being sold. The wallets of the Tibetan people empty while physicians grow rich. If the disease does arrive, go to the Western hospital. Tibetan medicine has no cure for this new virus." Was neither really at that stage did the Western hospital, the Western style medical hospital. And there was a bit of a blowback to this, and of course COVID did eventually start to reach the Tibetan areas, but a little momentarily on the Black Nine pill. You can see a Black Nine pill, which comes in a little pouch, and in fact you don't, although this is a pill, and pills normally in Tibetan are consumed, this is used more as an amulet. It's worn around your neck. If you're, this is actually a woman's version, so it has a blue bag. If you're a man, you have one which is more or less identical, except it has a red bag. And it's supposed to work primarily actually through a kind of aromatherapy effect. You sniff it every now and then, and the smell both restores the body's protective system and also perhaps keeps off dangerous influences. And Thupten Phuntsog turned out to be a bit of an outlier. Lamas, Sowa Rigpa practitioners and biomedical practitioners generally among Tibetans tend to have a cooperative relationship. They often refer patients to each other. Lamas may be knowledgeable about Sowa Rigpa. It used to be taught in many monastic colleges, and it has historical and philosophical links to Buddhism. And Sowa Rigpa practitioners, especially those trained in China, may have a fair degree of biomedical expertise as well. In any case, plenty of Black Nine pills, Naipo Gujo, were sold both in China and India. As far as biomedicine itself is concerned, Tibetans who have access to biomedicine, I'll come back to that later, are generally willing enough to use it, at least where they can trust those who are delivering it. This hasn't always been the case in the PRC. There was a period when people were very suspicious of Chinese doctors in the Tibetan areas, but things are somewhat better these days. I'll say a little bit about that later, perhaps. The problem, at any rate, is not biomedicine or modern science as such. The Tibetan Refugee Administration in India at Dharamsala from early on established parallel biomedical and Sowa Rigpa institutions, and it's continued to support both of them. In relation to major public health problems, such as the continuing high incidence of tuberculosis among the refugee population, it's always been accepted that biomedical treatment was the appropriate way to go. As Shanti, my wife, and I discovered when we were doing research in India some years ago, Tibetan women are happy to go to biomedical hospitals for childbirth and so on. Among the Tibetans in China, public health messages about COVID-19 were distributed from early on in the Tibetan language and in the form of recordings as well as printed text, as well as in various other minority languages spoken in the Tibetan regions. In some cases, these were actually the first time that local languages had received this degree of public salience. So there were some interesting responses to that. People took these messages seriously, in part because of the experience of the Sars epidemic, even though there were initially not very many cases in Tibetan regions. But for the Tibetans, as for us, it was evident that there was as yet no biomedical cure available for COVID-19, and people turned to Sowa Rigpa to see what resources it had that might help. Now, in China itself, as Tony Tidwell, among others, has noted, the pandemic got underway at a time when Sowa Rigpa was in a relatively strong position. perhaps as strong as it has ever been, at least since the Chinese takeover of Tibet. Sowa Rigpa was never entirely closed down by the Chinese authorities, even at the height of the Cultural Revolution. This was the era of the barefoot doctors, some of you may remember that term, and Sowa Rigpa was regarded as a branch of traditional Chinese medicine, because Tibet was, of course, by definition, a part of China for the Chinese authorities, and official policy at the time saw traditional Chinese medicine as valid and appropriate, at least for undeveloped rural locations. But at an institutional level, Sowa Rigpa went through a very difficult period, as did many individual practitioners, and the Buddhist aspects and non-biomedical theoretical base of Sowa Rigpa were heavily criticized. And it was only really gradually built up again at an institutional level in the 1980s onwards. And there's been quite a bit of writing about that by people like Ray Hofer and Sienna Craig. There's actually quite a lot of good medical anthropological work on Tibetan medicine. The Sars epidemic in 2002 to 3 considerably raised the profile of Sowa Rigpa. Tibetan medicine was widely seen, even by Han and Hui people in Tibetan regions, as trustworthy and as conveying some kind of ritual blessing and protection, along with its pharmacological action, as indeed it is intended to. It was produced and sold in large quantities throughout China, and this is when the Tibetan medicine workshops grew into large factories in some areas, which were starting to deal with quite industrial scale production. If any of you have been to Xining in recent years, you might have seen the big Tibetan medical factories there, and the large medical museum, which one of them's opened, and the medical school, and so lots happening. And the gradual defunding of state biomedical facilities in Tibetan regions, as elsewhere in China, led to the decrease of the biomedical clinics, but it led to the growth of Sowa Rigpa clinics. And by 2020, this year, they've effectively constituted the primary healthcare network in some regions of Tibet. So if you go to a clinic, this will be primarily a Sowa Rigpa clinic, though it will probably offer you some biomedical services too. For the Sowa Rigpa practitioners, this was an opportunity to the pandemic was an opportunity to re-establish the authority and reputation of their own medical tradition, and they took it very seriously. And the Chinese authorities, because after all there's been a religious revival in China, were while officially disapproving of the ritual and magical elements, were actually much less hostile than in the past. Tibetan Buddhism has been part of the Chinese religious revival and now has a substantial following among the Han population in China, with Dharma groups all around the country, including the big cities of the Eastern Seaboard, and people gathering regularly for video teachings in Chinese from lamas such as Khenpo Dzogchen Gyaltso or Khenpo Sadage. Meanwhile, in the USA, there was a somewhat parallel development. Sowa Rigpa had for many years been a very minor part of the alternative medical scene, but it had been growing somewhat undercover and had acquired a large enough presence that the American Society for Tibetan Medicine, which now exists, could rapidly put together a research project following some 20 different Sowa Rigpa doctors treating a couple of hundred patients with coronavirus. So a bit of a research base about developing in the West too about COVID and Sowa Rigpa. Now, Sowa Rigpa has always given considerable attention to infectious diseases. I'm sorry if part of the text there is covered over. I should have thought that this tends to happen a bit with Zoom, but at any rate, I'll this is looking at some of the major resources. The Tibetan medical classic, the Gyushi, generally now believed to have been written in the 12th century by, actually it's to be Yonten Gompo, not Yonten Gyatso. Other major sources include the Mengag Lentab, which is a supplement to the Gyushi by Desi Sangye Gyatso, the famous regent of Tibet in the 17th century and early 18th, who was himself a medical authority, and a series of Terma visionary texts, the Dutsi Bumpa, should be just one bum there, means vase of ambrosia, of Amrita, is one of these, which possibly date from the 11th century. At any rate, there are quite a few texts around that people could draw on, and quite a bit of experience, because although Tibet is not a country of big cities, it does have small towns which have had experience of epidemics in the past, and Tibetan doctors have been involved in dealing with them. Now, these texts discuss a variety of particularly virulent infectious diseases known as Nyenrim. Nyen is a term for a kind of spirit, in fact. And while authorities differ as to details, COVID-19 has generally been associated with this group of Nyenrim diseases. And I should say, while language is not highlighted very directly in this paper, you'll realize as we go on that the question of what things get called, what classes they get put into, has lots of implications. This is not just a question of medical nosology, it's also a question of people's understanding of what's going on. And this will come up most directly with the Momo themselves when we get to them. At the same time, it should be noted that Sowa Rigpa differs in many ways from biomedicine, and there's a certain natural complementarity perhaps between the two. The theory of Sowa Rigpa is based on a series of 3 pathogenic factors, the 3 Nyepa corresponding to the 3 dosha of Ayurveda, each of which has to be kept within appropriate limits. Now, this is not quite a humoral system, at least not in the sense of the classic Galenic tradition and its European and Islamic derivatives. And it was developed in specific directions in Tibet through syncretism with elements from Chinese and Islamic medicine, as well as indigenous Tibetan knowledge. But Sowa Rigpa nevertheless shares the concern of the major pre-modern scholarly traditions for overall balance within the organism, rather than working in terms of a targeted pharmacological assault on a specific pathogen. Sowa Rigpa has a quite extensive pharmacology, including complex combinations of mostly plant ingredients, along with some mineral and animal derivatives. They're tending to phase out the animal ones these days. And it's used along with these are used along with diet and behavioral prescriptions, and their various secondary techniques such as massage and cupping, herbal baths, moxibustion. In Western terms, it might make sense to describe much of Sowa Rigpa as oriented primarily around the strengthening of the immune system, and so maintaining the body's overall resistance to external pathogens. And this is certainly something that's been discussed at length by traditional Tibetan doctors in relation to the COVID pandemic. And this, as I was hinting, creates a certain complementarity to biomedical approaches, which tend to be more directly focused on countering a specific pathogen, in this case, the COVID virus. In addition, a wide range of Tibetan pharmacological formulae have been developed specifically in relation to epidemic diseases over the centuries, countering specific symptoms and illness patterns associated with the epidemic, which parts of the body it's affecting and in what way. And many of these have been called on in relation to the present situation. So one might say that Tibetan medicine is more focused on limiting the effects of the disease and maintaining the viability of the organism until the disease has run its course, rather than attacking the virus directly. And that also means that medicines designed in the context of one infectious disease may work reasonably well for another, because they're actually countering the organism's response more than the virus as such. Now, many of these medicines also have a significant ritual component in their creation or use. And when it comes to epidemic diseases, and particularly the Nyenrim, these particularly virulent infectious diseases, the class to which COVID-19 is generally assigned, pharmacological approaches, even with ritual supplementation, are seen as limited in their ability to meet the situation. These diseases are seen primarily as a result of the action of environmental spirits, spirits living in the the landscape, the mountain, the mountains, the rivers, the vegetation, who have been upset and disturbed by human behavior. And this implies that something has to be done directly to repair the relationship with the spirit world. And this goes back to the texts such as the Gyushi. This is Dr. Kenrab Gyamso, a senior doctor from the Dharamsala Mensikang, the main medical college in India, or one of the main Tibetan medical colleges in India, who now practices in Toronto, cites the Gyushi. This is in a video seminar, which is available on YouTube if people are interested. I can pass on details if people want them. The causes and conditions, this is a quote from the Gyushi, the Four Medical Tantras in English. The causes and conditions that originated the disease called Rin, that's a general term for infectious diseases and epidemics, occurred at the beginning of the final cycle of the 10,500-year cycles, whereby the desires of humankind led to much transgressive behavior, rampant murders of one's own Vajra siblings, the people one has religious links to, spread among Ngagpa lay tantric communities, monastics engaged in bitter quarrels within their sangha, extremists, this means non-Buddhists, the term he translates extremists, committed harm to others. Groups took vows to go to war and slaughter many. At the same time, the Momo, and here the first appearance of the Momo in this context, one of them, and the Dakinis, or other female spirits, were enraged, and the breath of disease manifested immense variegated clouds and gave rise to epidemic infectious disease, dysenteric conditions, pulmonary infections. So you can see Kenrab Gyamso is translating into a somewhat Western medicalized language here, but nevertheless, this is implicit within the Tibetan text. And here you can already see that the disease is being placed in a larger cosmological scheme and a wider linguistic scheme, that of the progressive decline of human behavior through a series of 10,500-year cycles. Now, this is a Tibetan version of an idea that may be familiar from the Hindu context to many of you, that of the Kali Yuga. And in fact, Tibetans will also in English talk about the Kali Yuga. But the idea is a long period of decline of the teachings after the time of the Buddha, which eventually leads to progressive degeneration of life, and then to the return of the Buddha, or the coming of the next Buddha, Maitreya, and the restoration of things through his teaching, which itself restores the nature of the universe. The Gyushi refers, in fact, to this idea of the time of degenerations, the time of decline, the Nigmedu in Tibetan. And this has 5 features which were reflected, some of in that quotation: the shortening of the length of life, the decline in the quality of foods and plants. Food is not as nutritious, declining good behavior among lay people who become dominated by pleasure, by disturbing emotions, the decline in understanding and right view in Tibetan terms among the Buddhist clergy, and a general decline in people's physical form, intellect, good health, and so on. Now, this is supposed to be the last 500 years. You may have noted that the last quote was actually from the 12th century, but I wouldn't, the question of precise timing here isn't really the point. It's more, this is a kind of general cosmological scheme, and whenever people talk about Nigmedu, Nigdu, this is a kind of a verbal phrase which is immediately recognizable, the time of decline, thing of life. And Kenrab Gyamso went on to cite the Menga Klentab, the oral instruction supplement to the Gyushi from the 17th, early 18th century. The causes ultimately arise from the 3 mental poisons. These are the klesha I just referred to: desire, hatred, and ignorance, in other words. So that at some level, this is to do with our emotional confusion, our lack of insight into ourselves. And they are specifically the intensely afflictive environmental influences. And this term dun refers to spirit attacks, but spirit attacks which have been kind of provoked by our behavior. The 8 classes of beings and others that inflict suffering of mental environmental origin. These 8 classes are spirits. 8 classes of spirits that are regularly counted in Tibetan ritual or encountered in Tibetan ritual. And again, I think Khenro Gyaltso's language is quite interesting. It balances what might be seen as relatively neutral scientific terms, environmental influences, with more traditional Tibetan references like the 8 classes of spirit beings. And like many Solar Rigpa doctors of his generation, he's evidently as familiar with scientific and biomedical modes of thought as with Tibetan traditional modes of thinking. He also points out that there is another aspect to the Gyushi's analysis of these diseases which is quite relevant, which is that of improper behavior. So on the one hand, there's the disturbed spirits because of the decline of the ages and our behavior which upsets them. But our behavior is itself a problem. Changes in the seasons that are in excess, deficiency or adversity. So here, climate change, in fact, is also being explicitly referred to. Exhaustion due to excess physical exertion, contagious transmission of illness, contact with toxins and poisons, extreme rage and fear, severe mental distress, excess attachment and greed, consumption of unsuitable or contaminated foods that cause infectious disease. I think the translation is being tilted a little bit here towards issues in the contemporary world, but again, it's not invention. This is drawing on implications that can be seen in the original text. Another senior Solar Rigpa doctor who's lived for many years in Italy, and there's an interesting interview with him on the web, speaks in very similar terms as is Pacific Arya. All the texts say that the cause of viral disease invasion in this world is due to human unethical and irresponsible misbehavior that lacks respect for nature, that destroys nature and the environment. The invisible nature protectors or natural defensive energy, which is called the 8 classic spirits. This is the same set of spirits, the Degi spirits, gets angry and turns into demons, what we call now climate change disasters. Who is behind those natural disasters? Regarding the viral and bacterial invasions, Tibetans say that the 8 classical spirits breathe out lethal poison breaths, which collect in the sky like clouds. The toxic breaths are carried by wind and can reach to any part of the world. They may enter the human body through the mouth, nose, and even through the body pores. They attack the human body's red blood cells or plasma. Chusa is a kind of 4th dosha or nipa in the Tibetan system, but I won't go into that here, begin to activate the poison and become tiny micro killer beings, which are called nyensin. So here again, this is giving a contemporary take, but it's very much drawing from the tradition. And these 8 classes of beings, as you can tell from, I think, from Pasanyantanarya's description, are both potentially positive, but also can be disturbed through human activity and then become negative. They're powerful and dangerous beings, if you want to think of them in sort of anthropomorphic sense or theomorphic sense, but they're not really gods in the sense of being morally superior to humanity or beings who live in the heavenly realms. They're just part of the spirit world, which of course most pre-modern cultures also share a sense of. There are slightly different listings of these beings, but they regularly include the Momo. And in fact, it's the Momo who are most generally regarded by Tibetans as responsible for the pandemic and other crises, and to whom much ritual activity has in fact been conducted in recent years. But before we turn to the Momo, and to the question of who and what they may be, it's worth mentioning that a variety of other primarily ritual procedures may be called on in the context of COVID, and there's quite a lot of this going on too. So they're the well-known practices of the medicine Buddha, also important in East Asia, in China and Japan, Menla or Vaisheshra Guru in Sanskrit. There is a prayer devised by the famous Saint Tanton Gyalpo, who you can see on the right here, in response to an epidemic at the monastery of Sakya in central Tibet. That works in part through a common Tibetan conception that speaking truth, here the truth about the nature of reality, has a salvific, has a health-bringing effect, a restorative effect, and can bring about changes in the material universe. And you see, in a way, this echoes the idea that when Maitreya comes and teaches the Dharma again, everything will be fine again. And there are also rituals focusing around a deity known as Panashavari, or Richo Loma Gyoma in Tibetan, or just Logyoma for short. Now, Logyoma means wearing clothes made of leaves. If you look at the left-hand image, you can see she's got this kind of grass skirt made on, draped around her, made of leaves. In fact, they're sometimes said to be medicinal leaves specifically. And this goddess, who's of Indian origin, in all probability, is believed to have gone to meditate for many years in the forest. The word Shavari actually means a woman of the jungle, a tribal woman in Indian terms. And I think this sense of the forest, of the wild, as a potential source of healing here is no accident. Maybe another interesting linguistic feature of what's going on. For the Tibetans, actually, it links to another well-known cultural theme, which is that of the idea of hidden and remote lands as sources of medicine and healing. I've been involved recently in editing a book on hidden lands, and this medical theme comes up significantly in that context too. Panashavari Logyoma is also often regarded as one of the 21 forms of the very important Tibetan goddess Dulma or Tara, and on the right you can see her as Panashavari Tara. There are several different lists of Tara's 21 forms. This isn't exactly isn't exactly a category which has been standardized across traditions, but in one of the most common ones, she's regarded as the 20th of the 21 forms. And I mean, you can go online and find rituals to Panashavari Tara and rituals to Panashavari and so on, if you're interested. Tara generally is invoked for help in situations of danger and difficulty, including illness. And one of her main forms, White Tara, is particularly associated with long life and health. So Panashavari fits quite well into this context. But I move now on to the Momo themselves and to the widespread understanding of COVID-19. I'm running a little late now, but I think I'll be through by about 10 to at the latest, hopefully. And that as the widespread understanding of COVID-19 is related to turmoil and disturbance among the beings of the Momo class. Now, Momo corresponds to the Sanskrit term Matara, or two Sanskrit terms, Matara and Matrika. And these are both generic terms for Indian mother goddesses who, like the Momo, cause illness and misfortune. In India, diseases, particularly diseases of children and infectious diseases such as, for example, smallpox, have long been associated with deities of this type. A particular set of Matrika deities, the Shapta Matrika, or seven mothers, also seems to have been used for sorcery and military magic in the Gupta period. So you could use this to send misfortune on other groups. And in Tibet too, one of the first major contexts in which the Momo gained prominence in the textual tantric tradition was as part of an important set of 8 tantric rituals known as the Kagye, which forms an important part of the Nyingmapa, the old tantra tradition. And the Momo are one of the 8 sets of deities here. These deities are mostly fierce in their appearance, and while their role in relation to the spirit world and its 8 categories are primarily defensive, they can be employed in more aggressive ways. Anne-Marie Blondeau, who's written some interesting material on the Momo based on texts in the early Momo Tantras, interprets the name of the Momo rituals, Momo Burtong, as meaning something like arousing the Momo to send them against your enemies. And the Momo Tantras include quite a few texts of this sort, which brings them fairly close to the military sorcery of the Gupta kings and the Shapta Matrika deities. But I think this is a bit to see them simply as a kind of derivative from India is actually a bit too simple. They're a mixture of Indian and Tibetan elements. One can read them as a nativization of Indian tantric ritual procedures, but one can also see them in terms of indigenous Tibetan concerns being rewritten in Indic ritual language. And the other thing which you find with a lot of these rituals of which in the Indian tantric context had strong elements of sorcery and aggression, and were clearly part of what tantric practitioners were. This was part of their stock in trade and what people were employing them to do, tend in Tibet to become more spiritualized and given a more positive reading. In any case, I don't think it's particularly useful to ask whether the Indian Matara Matrika on the one hand and the Tibetan Momo on the other were the same deities. Their mythology, the mythology of the Momo as presented in the Momo Tantras, is both deeply Indic at one level and deeply Tibetan on the other. In some contexts, such as the Momo Tantras, as they develop, they have a strongly indigenous feel. Elsewhere, one example might be Longchenpa's well-known commentary to the Guhyagarbha Tantra. They're directly equated with Indian goddesses. One could say quite a lot about that, but given time constraints, I'll present a summary of one of the most interesting of the Momo myths, which is an account of the origin of a central group of Momo, the six mothers, here called the Momo of the phenomenal world. So a tree grows, I'll just go fairly quickly, I won't read all of this. A tree grows up at the center of Mount Samara, the cosmic mountain at the center of the world. The root of this tree is surrounded by the ocean of the blood of the passions. Its bark flames of the fire of hatred. Its leaves are shaded by the darkness of mental obscuration. Its sap is full of the rocks of pride. The storm of envy rages around the top of the tree. If you were a Tibetan, you would immediately pick up that we're going through a list of 5 standard emotional problems or defects here. In the ocean of the blood of the passion, so the bottom of the tree, is the primal Momo, the mother Ma Chasangpungi Gyalmo. It is she who gives birth to the entire phenomenal world through her body of magical transformation. She who lengthens and shortens the lives and fortunes of all. She who both gives birth to the 5 elements and extinguishes them. She who exerts power over the 5 bodily elements of living beings. She whose sexual power dominates all male beings. The 5 elements come from her activity, so she gives birth to all. So here we see the Momo not as, you know, this kind of rather shady, evil, destructive spirit, but as this kind of quite cosmological creature that's giving birth to all of phenomenal reality, and I stress phenomenal reality, and so on and so on. This talks about actually about how she's holding the earth under control. She holds down the ocean with her right foot and keeps it from flooding the valleys. So in a sense, ecological disaster again is due to her, is avoided because she is keeping things in order. Her splendor crushes the hostile demons. So she is the universal healer. And so you can see how when she's doing the right thing, things are okay. So she's at the bottom of the tree. At the top of the tree is the primal father. And there's a rather cute story in which they emanate 2 birds because they can't get together directly. And the birds mate and they produce 5 eggs. And then these eggs get placed around the tree and they give rise to 5 daughter Momo, and the mother and father give names to them and so on. And these daughter Momo are also kind of cosmological. They produce the 5 elements and they correspond to the 5 elements. This is the Tibetans actually have both an Indic set of 5 elements, which are earth, water, air, fire, and space, Akasha. And they also have the Chinese set, but here it's the Indian set probably. So, they are, because they produce the 5 elements, they're Kuntuzangmo. Kuntuzangmo is the female aspect of the primal Buddha. But they're also the heavenly ones of the phenomenal world. They bring about the seasons and the climate and so on. The other story I'll come to in a moment. The other stories in the Momo Tantra are similar, and they describe various cosmogonic and mythical origins of the various sets of Momo. Now, what's rather striking here is that the Momo are strongly affiliated with the phenomenal world, the everyday world in which we live, and its underlying 5 elements, but also with Kuntuzangmo, the feminine aspect of the Dharmakaya of the primal Buddha. Some of you may have come across a recent Tibetanist book by Tony Huber, professor at Berlin, originally from New Zealand, called Source of Life. It's a massive and splendid book, over 1,000 pages long, 2 volumes, in which he traces the remains of a widespread non-Buddhist religious tradition throughout eastern Bhutan and western Arunachal Pradesh. These are areas which are now at least officially Buddhist. But this cult, which he calls the Supe La cult, the cult of the gods of the phenomenal world, it's the same word, super, the phenomenal world, is a religion based around earthly success and prosperity, fertility of plants, animals, and humans. And this is really a theme that runs all the way through Tibetan religion as well, in which Tibetan Buddhism has accommodated itself too. Now, the Momo don't feature in Huber's religious tradition as such, and despite their rather scary appearance, I think they're a bit more philosophical and Buddhicized and less folksy than the Simpala cult's deities. But most of their existence is on this plane of the phenomenal world. They seem to concede its reality and importance, even as they point to the possibility of its transcendence. And again, so what are the Momo doing? I mean, the language of the Momo is partly saying, yeah, the world is there, we have to deal with it, it's real, and that's, you know, we're not totally focused on transcendence. In another of the Momo Tantra stories, the primal Buddha, rather than this rather shadowy father figure, couples with the great mother primal Momo, and they have, and then, well, I'll skip that, but basically the 5 Buddhas, who are emanations of the primal Buddha, couple with the 5 Momo, who are produced by the primal couple. So here you get an even more sort of Buddhistized version. In a way, this story reads more like a cosmological diagram than it does like a myth. But again, it seems to recognize that the Momo are as essential as the Buddha to human life. And if we move on from a few centuries from these stories to one of the classic texts on pacifying the Momo, the tone is a bit different. This is Karma Chame in the early 17th century. But we can see the continuity from what we've heard previously. When children don't listen to their parents' words, an evil time and relatives quarrel, when people dress sloppily in clothes of rags, eating bad, cheap food, when there are family feuds and civil wars, these provoke the wrath of the Black Momo. Various women spirits fill 1,000 realms, sending sickness upon humans and beasts. The sky is thick with purple clouds of sickness. They incite cosmic warfare. They destroy by causing the age of weaponry. Suddenly they strike people with fatal ulcerous sores, and so on. And such texts became common among many of the Tibetan traditions. This is one of the best known ones. Now here we see the destructive side of the Momo, the phenomenal world going wrong. The Momo's turmoil is created by people's poor behavior, and it results in sickness and war. In fact, many lamas are convinced that the pandemic is just a prelude to a period of war and other misfortune. But if we can pacify the Momo, if we can restore them to a balanced state, reduce their turmoil and disturbance, then misfortune can cease and the world can be restored to balance. Karma Chagme's ritual, and these rituals in general, are offerings to the Momo, often incorporating confessions of human misdeeds. We've been doing all this dreadful stuff, you know, but we'll stop. And there's a lot more that could be said here. But the key issue for me is precisely that the pandemic is placed in a wider space of human and cosmic disorder. And this is a kind of combination of an originally Indic scheme, this time of decline and degeneration, which provides a general scheme to understand what's happening in the world, common to all Buddhist societies. We are in the end times, things are getting worse, and so on. But the turmoil of the Momo, the idea that this is linked to the disturbance of the Momo, provides a model for how this is happening. And it also provides a mechanism for doing something about it, both ritually and in terms of adjusting our behavior. And clearly this could easily extend into adjusting our behavior at an ecological level in relation to the world as a whole. So that's more or less all I have to say. I'll close with this image, which is, this is Ekajati, who is an important Buddhist goddess. Again, she's a kind of projection of the cosmic Buddha. So she's an enlightened being, but she has the form of a Momo deity. And so she can be a way of symbolizing the control of the Momo and their restoration into balance. And you'll notice she has one eye, one breast, and she's in many ways an expression of unity, of non-duality. So she's also very much an expression of a central message of one of the central messages of Tibetan Buddhism. Okay, so I'll finish there. Thanks very much. I hope somebody found something of interest in all that, and it linked a bit to the themes of the conference. Thank you.
Oh, thank you very much, Geoffrey. It was fantastic, very inspiring. So I'm sure there are many questions and comments from the floor. Any message in the chat? There's no message in the chat. So if you have a question, please just raise your hands, please. And Geoffrey, would you mind stop sharing the?
Yes, I'll move out of screen sharing.
Good. Thank you very much. Yes, Natasha.
I'd like to, thanks for the great presentation, Geoffrey. I'd like to ask about, you're talking about environmental aspects, but you know, with COVID, there are links to multiple species like the pangolin or the civet cat. And I was wondering whether you saw any references in the archival material to that recognition that these infectious diseases cross between species, because I saw a recent paper by Bartsaihan Norov, and he's written about infectious diseases, and I can send you the paper, but he's talking about the plague, and he's saying in the 12th century, this Buddhist monk was calling it marmot poison, and also rabies, dog poison. So I'm wondering whether there's any recognition of this sort of cross-species transmission in other infectious diseases.
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I'm not sure I can really answer it, to be honest. I think it's true in Tibet, as you were saying in your paper a couple of days ago, that the same people are often treating, Sarugpa doctors, may also be treating animals as well as human beings. And of course, people are living quite closely with animals, both among the Tibetan pastoral population and in the agricultural areas. So it wouldn't surprise me to see some of this, but I can't think of anything offhand. I don't think it's a significant theme in the medical classics.
You were saying that the categorizations are quite important, and yeah, that so the plague and the rabies were categorized within this sort of poison category, but I noticed that the sort of infectious diseases like influenza and I guess coronavirus are sort of categorized in another kind of category.
Well, yes, and in a way, because the infectious diseases are mediated through the Nien, through the spirit world. At one level, the tendency is to see the spirit as the agent.
All right.
Yeah, I suppose. And the ecological and environmental connection tends to come in at a second level. The spirits are upset because we've been making a mess of our relationship to the environment. We've been doing things that poison the environment and upset the spirits, and so the spirits are attacking us, rather than a direct recognition of a zoonotic disease causation. It would be interesting to see how they deal with that. I was intrigued by the question of bats, actually, because bats are in early Tibetan religion quite important cosmological creatures. They kind of mediate the relationship between earth and sky, and they turn up quite a bit actually in Tony Huber's book, but they also turn up in contexts in the main part of Tibet. I'm sure people have been talking about this out there somewhere, but I haven't come across it. I don't know if anybody else in the audience can contribute anything there.
Well, thanks.
Yes.
Ryan, yes.
Yes, thank you, Geoffrey, for this fascinating talk. You know, yesterday I presented a paper or something, you know, about things going on in Bali, the kind of similar approach, you know, talking about medical pluralisms in Bali, where, you know, at the community level and also the government level, they use this indigenous knowledge from, you know, distant past, which is still relevant in the contemporary context, and in particular, different kinds of rituals. And we see the Hindu-based, you know, practices that we see in Bali in a way pretty much similar to the Tibetan approaches that you talk about. My question is that you mentioned about this, you know, in Bali we have the approach by the government incorporating this traditional knowledge or, you know, practices to complement the modern biomedical approach to pandemic. But to what extent that, you know, this kind of things, the different levels of, let's say, you know, you have this local level, the government, and also individual level, at the family level, for example, continue practicing this traditional, you know, Buddhism-based knowledge to cope with a pandemic. Does the government in Tibet also sympathetic or explicitly adopt this, you know, supplementary approach to the pandemic?
Well, I think that there are maybe two levels to this. One is that of Sorigpa, of the traditional medical system, and the system in Tibet, as in China more generally, and rather like in India and where Sorigpa is now actually an official medical modality in the Indian system, is one of the recognition of the major non-biomedical medical traditions, of which Chinese medicine is one, and so Tibetan medicine, Sorigpa, fits in within that context. And they're not, I mean, they're not necessarily given the same degree of state support, but they do get state support at some level, and they do get official recognition as legitimate medical modalities. So that's in a way fairly straightforward. And then there is the question of the more ritual type procedures, which are more problematic, and which in theory are not supposed to happen. But in practice, in China, there is a general sense of tolerance and revival of religious practice. And in fact, Tibetan Buddhism has been a significant part of that, because, I mean, Han Chinese have been involved in Tibetan Buddhism for a long way back. But this is now happening on quite a large scale and mediated via the internet and video and so on. So there's, in practice, a lot of this stuff exists in a kind of grey area. It's not prohibited, it's not encouraged, and you never quite know where the limits might come. So you get this, you know, these huge monastic settlements with millions, well, hundreds of thousands of people coming, including many Han Chinese people in East Tibet, which suddenly get closed down or heavily restricted, and half the place is demolished and people are prohibited from coming for a while, and then they grow again, and it's all a bit iffy. There isn't an official policy really, or there is an official policy, but it's not in force. So a lot happens in the grey areas. With Tibetan medicine, I mean, because there's always been so much overlap and so much interpenetration. I mean, the Gyushi talks quite a lot about spirit-caused diseases, although it's primarily focused on pharmacology in terms of treatment. And Tibetan doctors generally have always been open to spirit disease, though they tend to see this as a kind of element of last recourse these days. You know, if you can't work out what's going on, let's check and see if it's a spirit. But traditional Tibetan modes of diagnosis are open to certain signs would indicate a spirit disease. So, you know, this can happen. I mean, when I was doing research in Dalhousie years ago in India, there were some quite interesting kind, again, I suppose, sort of language games really, in which you look for categories that sort of half acknowledge this might be spirit influence, rather, if possible, because, you know, you're also trying to maintain your scientific respectability, if you like. But nevertheless, in these circumstances, lots and lots of people are doing Momo rituals and Panashabari rituals and so on and so on. There's a lot of ritual activity taking place, and I don't think even in the Chinese People's Republic there's much attempt to restrain it. It's hard to know, things go on and off that.
Thank you. Fascinating. Looks like similar to the cases in Bali at, you know, at different levels. Thank you.
Yeah.
Yes.
Hi, Geoffrey. Thank you very much for that. That was an awesome presentation. Obviously, it's very much outside my area of expertise, but and I'm going to ask you a question which is kind of beyond this scope, I think, a little bit in terms of what you've been talking about. But as a public health researcher, I sort of looking at the official numbers for COVID in Tibet, and also Tibetans in like the diaspora throughout the world, and it's incredibly low numbers compared to some other areas with very low death rates. I mean, some of them are on par, but I'm wondering if you might comment a little bit. I'm not sure if you've got any comment in terms of those official numbers and how good those official numbers are, but it's more in terms of whether or not some of these indigenous systems which you're talking about are actually quite widely held by the populace, whether those systems are actually contributing maybe to an effective management system, and how that might actually be manifesting. So what are people doing in the community that might actually offer additional protections that maybe some other places are not being afforded?
Yeah, I think that's it's obviously a fascinating and quite significant question in policy terms. I don't really have any epidemiological material that I could cite here. In the States, it's quite interesting in that quite a few of the early cases of COVID-19, but also quite a lot of Tibetan medical personnel were working in New York City or roundabouts. So they're quite close to a very high early area of COVID activity. I think the main thing I would say, without being able to say, is it really making a significant difference, or is the treatment really making a significant difference, is that I think Tibetan orientations towards COVID would lead them to take it quite seriously and to follow the social distancing provisions and so on fairly rigorously. In other words, this isn't a population which is likely to move off into COVID doesn't exist, or it's a state plot, or all that sort of stuff. So, if you like, they've got their own conspiracy theories, but they're ones which are actually working positively in this context. It's the Momo, but that means that it's both proper and correct to go for both to follow biomedical prescriptions and to to follow Tibetan Rigpa prescriptions, which is quite interesting. I mean, one of the issues, I think, about COVID-19 more generally has been the question of how much attention has been directed towards building up people's resistance to the virus, as opposed to physically stopping the spread of the virus. This has been a kind of continuing sub-theme with people in let's say the alternative health type context, saying we should be looking at things like, say, zinc and vitamin D and their protective effect, and biomedical authorities basically ignoring all this for a while and then gradually taking it on until this starts to look relatively respectable. And you get articles in the Lancet and so on saying, yeah, zinc probably is useful, or vitamin D. And I think generally well, of course, you could say one of the effects of taking Tibetan medicine is just because they're so complex and there's so many ingredients, as you probably are getting a variety of possibly useful things there. But I don't particularly want to push that argument without a bit more evidence for it. I think what I would really say is what I've said, that I think the general set of ideas and the language and the rest of it through which Tibetans approach this situation, plus again the previous experience of SARS, which I think is really important here, has been a positive factor. I mean, I think that's been noticeable in Australia too, actually, where I live in Ashfield, as you know, and Ashfield has got a significant Chinese population, and it's noticeable that from back in February and March, you already had quite a lot of people wearing masks in public. You go to in a way that you don't find in many other areas of Sydney. And despite Ashfield having close links to the Chinese mainland, Ashfield and Burwood and other Chinese suburbs have had relatively low figures, and doesn't seem to be much direct transmission from China at any rate. I mean, I don't know, because I was following figures for a while and then I more or less gave up on this. Other people might want to comment. And I wondered how far this was that some of these East Asian derived populations just were taking things much more seriously than other parts of the Sydney population. In that case, the Tibetans would certainly be within that group. But as I say, this will be something it will be good to know more about, and it will be good to know what the this American Tibetan Medical Association project eventually comes up with, because they trace quite a number of people with COVID who've been treated by Tibetan medicine and are continuing to do so.
Great. So we a bit run over time, but it was fantastic. I'm sure there are many other questions, but we can probably follow up in another occasion. But yeah, so thank you very much, Geoffrey. It was fantastic. I've got a few questions, but we can do that in another occasion. We don't have time today. So please join me.
Fatigue, yes.
Pardon?
We have to watch about inflicting too much Zoom fatigue on ourselves.
Yeah. So please join me in thanking Geoffrey. It was a really, very, very good and fantastic talk. Yeah.
Thanks very much.
Yeah, and thank you for all your participation. And our